Okay, let's dive deep. Today, we're looking at a relationship that's just fascinatingly consistent, really. India and Russia.
Hmm.
You've brought us a great stack of sources. And our goal here is to unpack it, try to understand the core forces, the big moments, the strategic interests that shaped this bond.
Right.
Why did this one last when others, well, they shifted so much?
Yeah, it's really interesting when you put it next to others we've looked at recently, like India-China or India-US. Those often had, well, a lot of mistrust, even conflict, right? Especially back in the Cold War.
Definitely. Divergence was often the theme there.
Exactly. But this relationship with Russia or the Soviet Union, for most of its history, it's different. It actually started, believe it or not, with a bit of skepticism.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but it grew into something really foundational for both sides.
Okay, and that journey, that evolution, that's what we're here to explore. From those first, maybe uncertain steps, through that really tight strategic alignment, then navigating challenges, and looking at where it is now.
Let's do it.
All right, so let's go back to the very beginning. India's just become independent. You might think, okay, future close ally must have been friends from the start. But the sources suggest Moscow wasn't exactly rolling out the welcome mat for Nehru.
No, that's absolutely right. The material points to, well, quite a bit of initial skepticism from the Soviets, especially under Stalin.
Stalin specifically.
Yeah. He apparently saw Nehru as, too influenced by the West. Even that whole non-alignment thing, Stalin saw it as ambiguous, maybe even leaning towards the old colonial powers.
Wow. Not exactly a warm start then.
Not at all. Pretty chilly, actually, considering how important the relationship became later.
So if Stalin was wary, what turned it around? How did Moscow's view change?
Well, the sources really point to Khrushchev as the turning point, Nikita Khrushchev. He was, let's say, more pragmatic.
Okay.
He saw India's growing importance, its geopolitical weight. And crucially, this was right when the Soviet relationship with communist China started going sour.
The Sino-Soviet split brewing.
Exactly. So getting closer to India looked strategically smart, a potential counterweight to China, which was becoming, well, unpredictable from Moscow's perspective. And politically, Nehru's socialist ideas were probably easier for Khrushchev to stomach than they were for Stalin.
Okay, that makes sense from the Soviet side. But what about Nehru? India was non-aligned, right, trying to carve its own path. Why was he drawn to the Soviet model, especially if they were initially a bit cold?
Well, the sources suggest Nehru just had this sort of instinctive connection to certain aspects of the Soviet economic approach.
Like what?
His own thinking. Fabian socialism, it stressed state-led industry, central planning, focusing on social equity. To build a new nation like India, that model probably felt more relevant, more practical for India's massive challenges than, say, the pure U.S. capitalist way.
And he had issues with the U.S. at the time, too, didn't he? Quite serious with...
Oh, definitely. The material mentions he was really troubled by things like racial segregation in America. That clashed hard with India's own values.
Yeah.
But maybe even more crucial for foreign policy, he wasn't comfortable with U.S. alliances with countries like Britain and France, the old colonial powers.
Right, India had just thrown off colonial rule.
Exactly. So India really identified with anti-colonial movements everywhere. Seeing the U.S. team up with the old guard just didn't sit right.
So, putting it together, Stalin's doubt, then Khrushchev's strategic shift, plus Nehru's own leanings and his unease with Western alliances. It sounds less like love at first sight and more like converging interests and maybe shared dislikes.
That's a good way to put it. I think the key takeaway from that early time is it wasn't just about shared ideals immediately. It was a mix. Strategic thinking from Moscow, combined with Nehru's particular vision for India, that ended up making the Soviet Union seem like, as the sources say, a more natural partner for India's really tough post-independence path.
It laid the groundwork.
It really did. Essential groundwork. And speaking of that tough path, India's neighborhood back then was, well, incredibly challenging. That really pushed things along.
Oh, absolutely. You think about the context. India felt betrayed by China, after trying to be friendly, constant threats from Pakistan. Yeah. The sources mentioned this feeling that U.S. aid to Pakistan might even be used against India.
Right.
And then the U.S. just seemed, well, unreliable from Delhi's perspective, especially sticking so firmly with Pakistan. India really felt squeezed, strategically vulnerable.
And this is exactly where the Soviet relationship shifts gears. It goes from being just a potential partner to being the primary strategic support. As India felt more and more caught between these rivals and maybe not getting the backing it wanted from the West, the USSR really stepped up, became the main defense supplier.
And it wasn't just like basic stuff they were supplying it. It was serious military hardware.
Oh, yeah. We're talking advanced fighter jets. The MiG-21 became iconic, didn't it?
Yeah.
Tanks, submarines, often supplied on pretty good terms, too.
Favorable terms, yeah.
But it went beyond just weapons. The sources also highlight really important cooperation in science and tech. The Soviets helped India launch its first satellites. And you can't forget Rakesh Sharma, India's first man in space, flew on a Soviet Soyuz mission back in '84.
That's such a powerful symbol, isn't it? Of
Yeah.
deep trust, deep partnership beyond just selling military kit.
Exactly. So the relationship wasn't just transactional. It was deepening into a real strategic bond, forged in the fire of all that geopolitical pressure.
It became this partnership based on what? Mutual benefit.
Pretty much. For India, it was vital. Build up its military, its industry, but also protect its strategic autonomy, that ability to make its own decisions.
And for the Soviets.
For them, it gave them a solid foothold in South Asia, helped them balance against their own rivals like the US and China.
Which leads us directly to maybe the most intense moment, the real test. The 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War.
Yeah, that was the crucible, absolutely. The ultimate test for this partnership. India steps in, supports the independence movement in what was then East Pakistan.
And the global powers took sides immediately.
Instantly. The US and China backed Pakistan. The sources talk about the Nixon administration sending the US 7th Fleet into the Bay of Bengal. That was a serious show of force, a direct threat.
Wow. So facing that kind of power play, India needed some heavy-duty diplomatic backup.
Desperately. To finish what they started. And they turned straight to Moscow.
And the Soviet Union.
It came through, big time. At the UN Security Council, the Soviet Union just kept using its veto power, again and again, blocking resolutions that called for ceasefires or condemned India. That gave India the breathing room, the diplomatic cover it absolutely needed.
And the sources suggest those vetoes had ripple effects, didn't they? Beyond just the '71 war.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It connects directly to the Kashmir issue, which was always simmering. Those Soviet vetoes basically helped India keep the Kashmir dispute from being internationalized in ways Delhi didn't want.
Like preventing UN interventions or plebiscites.
Exactly. Things the West sometimes pushed for. Consistent Soviet vetoes helped India resist that external pressure on Kashmir, maintain its position.
So those vetoes in '71, they weren't just diplomatic chess moves. They were actively enabling India to change the whole power dynamic in the region.
Absolutely. They gave India the space it needed to defeat Pakistan militarily, help Bangladesh achieve independence, and literally redraw the map of South Asia. The sources are really clear on this. That moment was the absolute peak of Indo-Soviet cooperation, the high point.
And there was a formal treaty underpinning all this, wasn't there? Signed just before the war.
Yes, good point. The Indo-Soviet Treaty of Peace, Friendship, and Cooperation, signed in August '71. It essentially formalized what was already becoming a very strong de facto alliance, and it set the stage for that crucial Soviet support just months later. Now, to really get why this bond lasted, you also have to flip it and look from Moscow's angle. India wasn't just, convenient. It became really, really critical to Soviet global strategy.
Especially, I guess, as things got worse between Moscow and Beijing.
Oh, hugely. The Sino-Soviet split was massive. By the late 60s, it wasn't just ideological differences anymore. It was actual strategic hostility. They even had border clashes, like on the Ussuri River in '69.
Right.
Moscow was genuinely worried about China rising, becoming unpredictable, challenging Soviet leadership, especially in Asia.
So India was the perfect counterweight from Moscow's perspective.
It really was. India brought a lot to the table for them. It was big, it was non-aligned, but leaning in ways they liked. It was fiercely independent, which was useful, actually. It helped balance China without forcing India into like a rigid Soviet bloc.
And India already had its own tensions with China after the '62 war.
Exactly. That made India much more open to deeper defense ties with Moscow. Plus, backing India gave the Soviets a major presence, real leverage, in South Asia, a region China was also eyeing.
And then things got even more complicated, right? When
Yeah.
the U.S. and China started getting closer. Nixon going to Beijing in '72.
Yeah, from Moscow's perspective, that looked bad. Like strategic encirclement, their two biggest rivals suddenly warming up to each other.
That must have rung alarm bells.
Big time. And it immediately made India even more important to the Soviet Union.
Why? as a way to push back against that.
Precisely. Strengthening ties with India was a way to make sure China didn't just dominate Asia unchecked. And it stopped the U.S. from dominating the subcontinent just through Pakistan. India became this crucial buffer, this balancer in that really complex triangle, U.S.-China, USSR.
So investing in India was smart geopolitics for Moscow.
Absolutely. It secured a reliable partner in the Indian Ocean, helped contain China, and kept U.S. influence in check. It was a very calculated, multi-level strategic play.
But then fast forward, the world shifts dramatically. The Soviet Union collapses in 1991. That must have sent shockwaves through this relationship.
Oh, it absolutely did. It triggered a period of real challenge, lots of recalibration. After the collapse, Russia was just consumed with its own internal problems, massive restructuring.
Looking inward.
Totally. And there was this natural drift. At the same time, India started opening up more to the West. That really picked up pace after India's nuclear tests in '98.
And that drift had real-world impacts, didn't it? Especially for India's military, which relied so much on Soviet gear.
Huge impacts. The material talks about major disruptions in defense supply chains, spare parts, new contracts. It all got messy. That was a massive headache for the Indian armed forces.
And diplomatically?
Less high-level contact, too. Fewer summits, less of that constant engagement you saw during the Soviet era.
And then more recently, say the 2010s, new bumps in the road appeared. Things you probably wouldn't have imagined during the Cold War peak.
That's right. Russia actually started some limited military cooperation with Pakistan. Things like joint exercises, even some small arms sales.
Wow, with Pakistan. Given the history, that must have really raised eyebrows in Delhi.
Understandably unsettling, yeah. At the same time, India was actively diversifying its own defense sources.
Buying those Rafale jets from France, drones from the U.S.
Exactly. And that kind of diversification, while logical for India, probably caused some unease in Moscow, too, after being the dominant supplier for so long.
It signals a shift, right? India moving towards having multiple strategic partners, not just relying so heavily on one.
Definitely. A clear sign of India's evolving strategic thinking.
Okay, so despite all that, the drift after 91, these newer frictions like Russia-Pakistan ties, India buying kit elsewhere, despite all that, the core strategic relationship has somehow remarkably lasted.
And that endurance, that resilience is maybe the most interesting part of the story today. Even with those tensions, Russia is still absolutely central to India's defense setup.
The S-400 deal is the big example, right?
Exactly. India went ahead with buying that advanced missile system, even facing potential U.S. sanctions. That tells you just how strategically vital India still considers Russian defense technology.
And it's not just buying off-the-shelf stuff. Collaboration continues.
For sure. Look at the BrahMos missile project. That's a joint venture, a real symbol of ongoing high-tech partnership. And don't forget civil nuclear energy. Russia's support for the Kudankulam power plant is huge for India's energy plans.
Diplomatically, too, India's position on really tough issues, like the war in Ukraine since 2022, has been very closely watched.
Yes, and the sources point to India maintaining this careful neutrality, not condemning Russia outright, but consistently calling for, dialogue, diplomacy, respecting sovereignty. It's a real balancing act.
Trying to walk that line.
Trying to protect its own strategic autonomy while navigating a very polarized world.
And presumably, that neutral stance is something Russia values quite highly right now.
You'd have to think so. At a time when Russia is facing a lot of international isolation, India's position kind of underscores its value as this dependable, long-term partner, even if they're not allies in the formal Western sense.
So, looking at the relationship today, it's clearly not just about holding on to the past, is it? Not just nostalgia.
No, not at all. It's complex, it's dynamic, there's deep strategic cooperation still, absolutely. But there's also pragmatic adjustment happening all the time based on today's realities. It seems guided more by realism now.
Realism over nostalgia.
Exactly. That enduring bond seems built on mutual respect, yes, but also overlapping interests and just this long shared history of figuring things out together. It shows how that historical trust can actually allow a relationship to bend and adapt even when the whole world around it changes.
Wow. We've covered a lot of ground. From that initial surprising skepticism through intense strategic alignment driven by mutual need and external threats, becoming this cornerstone for India's foreign policy and a really key piece for Soviet and now Russian strategy, too. It's a bond that's lasted to the Cold War, its end, and now into this messy, multipolar era.
Yeah, it's definitely not a simple story, but it's such a powerful example of how countries adapt, how they find common ground, and how they build these partnerships that can actually withstand massive global
Well,
shifts.
understanding that long, complex history really gives you, the listener, crucial insight into why India makes some of the foreign policy choices it does today. That balancing act makes more sense. Its history very much alive in the present.
Which leaves us with a final thought, maybe something provocative for you to mull over. Given the world we're in now, with intensifying competition between the big players, the US, China, Russia, what does the sheer endurance of this specific India-Russia partnership actually tell us about the future of alliances? What parts of this unique relationship might become even more important as this great power contest keeps unfolding in the 21st century?